matrix of exploitation. Click that button. Or multiple and intersecting social, economic, spatial, and workplace inequalities that generates the basis for a confluence of both community and worker resistance. And so what we've identified is kind of the basis for blue-green and even broader resistance that we've seen actually is kind of coming to fruition, even though the roots of it might lay deep in kind of like the 1970s, and we're finally seeing it really come into action now. So for those who are less familiar with the region, this is inland Southern California. So it is part of the greater Southland, consisting of San Bernardino and Riverside County, two very large counties that stretch almost from the coast to the border of Nevada and Arizona. And San Bernardino, I believe, is the largest county in the United States. And in terms of Amazon, it is huge. It has completely taken off. There are more than 50 facilities in inland Southern California right now. And it is currently the largest private employer in the region. And so even though it isn't the only source of a lot of bad news here, as the largest private employer and the biggest number of warehouses, it's certainly the major contributor to bad air quality and related health risks associated with goods movement in this predominantly working class and Latino region, and certainly a major contributor to precarity, impoverishment, high rates of injuries among blue-collar warehouse workers, most of whom are Latino and growing numbers of which are women. So what are the challenges and opportunities for collaborations in response to Amazon warehousing? So the big challenge, of course, is this perceived conflict between the environmentalists and both the labor activists and developers kind of goals. There's been this long idea that there's a conflict between environmentalists and labor activists. And really what we've found is they kind of have common cause against against kind of the developers' goals. And then the developers, certainly since the 1980s, even really since before that, have been in cahoots with the politicians and kind of the visions of big money and the ports. And so in that sense, the environmentalists and the labor activists and now community activists really have common cause against that. So there really are a lot of opportunities for these people to kind of come together, these groups to come together. So there's longstanding public resistance to warehousing that's associated with traffic congestion and then public environmental health risks. There's also increasing awareness about the situation, certainly since 2008, as we've had more organizations kind of come together. So Warehouse Workers United campaign, Sheheryar might want to bring this into some of his comments, as he's been a part of this movement since then. The Warehouse Workers Resource Center was a part of that, established later in 2011, has become the biggest part of the voice of warehouse workers' labor activism since then. And then more recently, i.e. Amazonians Unite, established much more recently, kind of in the midst of the pandemic era organizing. And then around that, an increasing and growing awareness within the labor movement to responding to the environmental and climate crises that's associated with the expansion of Amazon warehousing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so Ellen and I also did some just broader research on what was going on during the pandemic, with so many people sort of home and able to really be witness to what was happening as they were both home, and some specific portions of the population were particularly exploited during that period. And so there are a myriad and different kinds of things going on that we could certainly get into in the Q&A. But one way to sort of see it all in one place is the opposition to Amazon's expansion at the San Bernardino International Airport. Amazon wants to do everything and do it big. And one of the things that they'd like to do is grow their air freight business, and many of the organizations and resistance movements that had been kind of moving on their own in various kinds of ways came together in this one place. And so this slide gives you sort of a quick look at all the different kinds of organizations that have come together, in small and in large in this case. And so you can see that it's both that it is both substantively broad and very, very diverse in terms of being in environmental, being of faith, different kinds of faiths, being about labor and being different kinds of labor, being a youth, and being in different geographical spaces. So it's a very broad and diverse group of organizations and peoples and communities that have come together now against Amazon and then warehousing more generally. So what have we managed to accomplish? A lot of things over time, but more recently, there was a Kaoosji ruling in favor of warehouse workers at the East Cape facility that led to improvements in COVID-19 safety training around Amazon. So some really egregious breaches of safety at Amazon. And so we did have kind of pandemic era rulings against Amazon there that led to some improvements. And then even more recently, California's passage of AB 701, first law of its kind in the nation that was passed in response to warehouse worker labor activist demands for more worker rights. And so many people have heard about this, but just, we have it up here very quickly. It's going to protect workers from meeting work rates. And so that's a pervasive issue within warehouses, but most people really know about it in the case of Amazon, folks having to meet ever increasing work rate demands, and then a whole lot of health issues that follow along that, and then also just not being able to keep your job. And then it protects warehouse workers from employer retaliation. And then ensures that the California Labor Commissioner is going to collaborate with other stakeholders to educate workers and employers about AB 701, and will be notified if particular warehouse employers has an injury rate that is excessive for the warehouse industry as a whole, right? So this is a big step forward. And then with respect to the environment or environmental justice activism, again, lots of things if we wanted to look back going into some of the things that have happened historically, but really coming to fruition more recently. Earth Justice reached a very large settlement in 2021 with respect to the World Logistics Center, and that's out in Moreno Valley. It's been identified as an indirect source of air pollution, so it hasn't been built yet. I'm winding up right now. And because of that, it's going to have to invest in electrification of trucks and other sorts of things to rein in the impacts on the immediate area, including some wildlife that might be threatened. And in addition, the South Coast Air Quality Management District has adopted an indirect source rule that's going to affect other warehouses. So not just this particular one, not this one case, but this is a rule that's going to be impacting all very large warehouses in the region. And in terms of kind of broader sorts of things, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the big punchline. What we're seeing is local blue-green coalitions are being able to make kind of greater, broader, longer term demands. One of these things that they've been able to do are warehouse moratoriums that are temporarily blocking the approval of new warehouse developments, not permanent, but it is kind of giving space to bring on, kind of giving the space to either have community benefits agreements or at least more judicious development of warehousing, or to wait for some of the other kinds of legal remedies and mitigations to come online before any new warehousing comes into place. And these warehouse moratoriums are in Chino, Colton, Riverside, and Jurupa Valley. So in conclusion, this area really is a microcosm of larger trends worldwide, not just in the United States, but internationally. So in our text and our conclusion, we do go into all the other places in the world where very similar kinds of things are happening. And so just to highlight some of those sorts of things, the communities of color, places where there are poor people along your transportation corridors, kind of out of sight in areas that are serving more prosperous areas. These places are being targeted by Amazon. There is a logic to beginning to target and put your energies into bottom up kind of activism. It does work. We're seeing it here. And there is growing community opposition to warehousing. People are learning, they are able to protect their communities. They do understand what's going on, and they are very engaged and effective. Thank you very much for your attention. We appreciate it, and we are happy to answer questions when we have the opportunity to do so.
Thank you, Juliann. I'm going to share screen. Let me know if, are you seeing what let me get the title slide.
Yes.
Okay, great. Just a reminder to everyone in my role as chair that we're collecting questions in the Q&A, questions, comments. And so after the presentations and Sheheryar's discussing comments, we will address those questions as well as Sheheryar's discussing comments and anything that panelists want to address in terms of the other presentations as well, just in terms of our modus operandi. So my co-author Kaoosji is here, and João Paulo, who's getting to a better internet connection, should be along shortly. I'm going to, given the time considerations, presenting our work, and it's really our effort to reflect on a very preliminary research project and to define an agenda, which in part grows out of our prior research in a book that came out last year about Walmart in Latin America, focused heavily on work in Brazil, but also including comparative examination of Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. And being steeped in the literature of several decades of Walmart research about Walmart and labor in the United States and then in global expansion, and then the more recent Amazon literature, the Walmart experience in particular in that literature leads us to ask certain questions and pose certain issues for thinking about Amazon's very recent incursions and rapid expansion into Latin America's two largest markets, and perhaps behind that into other markets. So it needs no overemphasizing that we're dealing with two multinational American logistics firms. Remember, IT-led firms. That was the supply chain management was Walmart's competitive genius. But as we compare the two firms, Amazon being a more recent firm, it's been more precocious and more aggressive in its internationalization than was Walmart with its expansion from the early 1990s. 24 countries for Walmart, 23 expanding to at least 2 more in terms of e-commerce and distribution for Amazon. The UNCTAD has something called the Transnationality Index, looking at the share of foreign to total assets, revenues, and employees, where Amazon actually ranks higher, is more transnational by this measure than is Walmart, 31 to about 25. And as far as the share of direct global workforce overseas, the end of last year, Amazon actually ranks higher than does Walmart, even with its longer history of internationalization at around 31 versus 27%. So there are reasons to compare the two firms and to ask if we can learn something about the experience of organizing and trying to engage with or confront Walmart. These are some of the points that I'm going to go over rapidly, one by one in the subsequent slides. A first point, looking at a comparative international perspective, is that competitive success of American companies with very American models are very contingent and contested as they go overseas. Here is a list of 7 different G20 markets where Walmart exited, failed on its own terms after a few years, or after quite a few years in the case of Argentina and Brazil, across 3 different continents. What does that say about Amazon? Well, Amazon did fail in the big prize outside the United States, which is China, which we cannot forget. It hasn't really been adequately explained and analyzed, perhaps. After 15 years, it shut down its e-commerce site and its distribution, and it never achieved more than a 1% market share. As we look at this issue through the lens of Walmart in Latin America, we find a very bipolar sort of picture. Quick market dominance for the company in Mexico from the 1990s and Chile in the 2010s when it enters later, achieving market domination in supermarkets and then moving into e-commerce as well. Whereas in Argentina and Brazil, it wasn't able to consistently crack the top 2 and was a 3rd to 5th place market share company throughout its 2 decades plus in those 2 markets. So it never really cracked the code in those 2 large South American markets and ended up withdrawing. Of note, it faced Franco-Brazilian tie-ups in Brazil that it was not able to surpass in terms of market leadership there. Amazon today in Latin America is a new player since the mid-2010s and a nascent but fast expanding by double digits annually national e-commerce markets in Brazil and Mexico. Interestingly, it is in Mexico trading places with the so-called Multi-Latina, the Argentina-based firm Mercado Libre, often referred to in the business press as the Amazon of Latin America. In Brazil, Amazon is still in 4th place in a rapidly expanding market. Also elsewhere in the region, with data centers and call centers, Amazon has moved into 4 other countries, and possibly in some of those that could be a precursor to later setting up e-commerce websites and distribution facilities. A key factor to keep in mind based on our research and the research of others is that as was the case with Walmart, Amazon, as it did in China as well, faces strong competition from locally owned or locally established competitors, including Walmart itself in Mexico, where it's been the leader in retail since around 2000, and also has a very big e-commerce operation. And oftentimes that factors in terms of the ability to adapt strategies which are diffused from the home country, home office, such as the issue of developing payment systems that are adequate for a large unbanked population in the informal sector, such as we have in Latin America and in both these countries. Related to that, and these gets back to issues of studying multinational corporations and their often fraught and complex and contingent relationship with host countries, is the very low degree of autonomy that both Amazon, following in the footsteps of Walmart, seem to concede to local managers and local affiliates. They're treated as extensions of the home office, including for financial reporting purposes. All of this brings us to the point that national institutions and varieties of capitalism can still be salient, even in a globalized world and even with IT-led tech firms. Where does contestation around labor practices fit into this story? Well, what we find and what others have found is that it's very mediated by national institutional trajectories in terms of the forms of organization of the trade union movement, in terms of also national regulatory and enforcement institutions. We found significant degrees of contestation at Walmart in both Brazil and Chile, contrasted with very low and sporadic levels of contestation over several decades in Mexico and Argentina, to illustrate this kind of broader theoretical point. As we take this insight into considering Amazon's recent and ongoing incursion into Latin America, what we note in looking at these two largest markets in the region is a certain ongoing role reversal taking place in the last few years. Brazil with stronger labor institutions up to the mid-2010s, Mexico with neoliberal flexible institutions going back to reforms dating to the 1980s. However, Mexico with the national labor law reform in the last few years, a new law regulating the practices of contracting, labor commitments, labor rights commitments under the USMCA, the successor to NAFTA. So some strengthening labor protections that Amazon will face going forward versus a weakening of those protections with national flexible labor law reforms in 2017 in Brazil, along with having a right-wing anti-labor president for the last 4 years. Hopefully not after this upcoming fall national elections there. As we consider in this comparative perspective on Amazon in Latin America, I think it's important, we think it's important to consider the evolution, the arc over time of how there's been perhaps some shift in the older issues, say of an undermarket, low-wage employer, high turnover, lack of benefits, to more recent investments in the global north in sort of human capital for at least the core workforce. But together with these issues that seem to be driving recent organizing campaigns and strikes having to do with high accident rates, turnover, burnout, algorithmic surveillance, and the like, just a very stressful workplace. How, we ask, will this play out in these new markets in Latin America? Particularly considering the high levels of informality that I mentioned, high levels of open unemployment, and a certain buyer's market for labor that exists in those countries. But on the other hand, also countries where reportedly in some of our initial interviews, Amazon is having trouble recruiting enough warehouse workers with the minimum levels of formal education combined with some basic English proficiency to be able to work with the IT-led devices in their warehouses. A final question that emerges as we look at the varied experiences, particularly in the global north, and consider Walmart's historical experiences, is who will do the organizing? E-commerce raises these jurisdictional issues of collaboration across transport, logistics, and retail, traditionally with separate unions and separate collective bargaining processes where there are unions at all. So what's the role of traditional unions in bargaining? What's the role of the kind of bottom-up activism like we see with platform delivery workers, Uber drivers, et cetera? We do see those networks emerging in both of these countries and elsewhere in Latin America. In the case of Mexico, there's some presence of Amazon delivery drivers. What role will that play in terms of the Amazon value chain? And finally, the kind of community and multi-stakeholder networks that, for example, Juliann and Emmons research describes, whether at the subnational level or transnationally or working together, what role will they play? Will we see them emerging in localities that are really starved for jobs and investment, and where local governments have been basically rolling out the red carpet to get these warehouses in the first place? So that's a quick and dirty overview of some of the issues that we try to raise as we go into further depth with our research going forward. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to your questions and comments. And with that, let me stop sharing screen. Just a second. Don't want to leave. So it should be enabled for Mustafa, if you'd like to screen share. Are you able to, or is my screen still showing up? Mustafa Henaway from Concordia University and also from the Immigrant Workers Center in Quebec, who's worked at Amazon and been very active in organizing efforts there, as well as being a labor scholar. Mustafa?
Thank you so much, Scott, and I'm really glad to be on this panel. So, for me, I'm currently a PhD candidate at Concordia University in geography, planning, and environment, but also active with the Immigrant Workers Center since 2007, and a lot of our work in warehousing and logistics came as a result more through trying to organize with temporary placement agency workers in the Montreal area. And and it is true, I was a former Amazonian. That's what we call ourselves at the night shift. I worked at a delivery station at on the outskirts of Montreal. And so and that was really the context of wanting to deal with Amazon in my own PhD research, was sort of the challenges to organizing how Amazon was sort of shaping and reshaping logistics. And because logistics is an important sector in terms of precarious work in the Montreal area, right? And so the research led me to my own ethnographic research in terms of as a warehouse worker organizer, but also now being a key member of MAWU, the Montreal Amazon Workers Union, which is supported by the CSN, Confederate Syndicats Nationaux, which is the second largest trade union federation in Quebec. People don't know Quebec has quite a bit of labor pluralism. So there's 4 trade union federations in Quebec. And also my research has been with former and current Amazon workers. I've roughly done 24 so far, but also with trade unionists and other labor lawyers and activists. So just to give a bit of context quickly about Montreal, because a lot of people will be coming from south of the border, is that Montreal is a significant logistics hub for North America. It employs over 100,000 workers in the Montreal area. It has significant state support because Montreal is considered an logistics hubs of Inland Empire, New Jersey, Southern Chicago, or Southern Illinois. So Montreal has established itself as a key intermodal hub between the 2 free trade agreements, right? So the Canada-European Trade Agreement and NAFTA USMCA. So as a result, it can utilize being in between both trade agreements as being a key logistics hub. And much like other logistics hubs and warehouse work, a lot of that work is done by temp work. It's racialized. Immigrant labor, it's flexible, it's grueling. There's this constant requirement for a cheap pool of labor, and a lot of that cheap pool of labor has been Trump's refugees actually over the last 5 years, right? So a lot of people who've crossed the border through irregular means, who are mostly coming from Western Africa, from Nigeria, but also from India, and the Middle East. And I won't get into that. So Amazon, and so we've been dealing with a lot of these issues and sort of the challenges to organizing with warehouse workers and temp agency workers for better health and safety. So and a lot of the comparisons was always to Amazon, right? How do we Dollarama is our Amazon, these warehouses are Amazon, right? And so but Amazon's presence not existed in Quebec until 2020, right, formally. So in Canada, though, there's been a rapid expansion to 46 facilities, delivery stations, fulfillment centers, sort centers, and now there's roughly 40,000 workers in Canada. But in Quebec, you have 6 facilities that have opened up in 2 years, right? So we have 3 delivery stations 2 fulfillment centers, and 1 sortation center, all ringing the island of Montreal. And Amazon's presence in Quebec is quite large, despite sort of a distinct political economy. So 48% of online purchases are made through Amazon in Quebec, right? Totaling $16 billion in sales last year. And 1 out of 3 Quebecers are actually Amazon Prime members, right? In a recent study that came up. So roughly we have 2,000 workers, right? And no one in Quebec is unionized in Amazon nor in Canada. We do have the efforts in Alberta through Teamsters, outside of Edmonton, which recently also, like Bessemer, they weren't successful at their first union drive, right? So I'm actually going to skip the sort of the theoretical part where I kind of use sort of digital Taylorism and Kim Moody's work on time-based competition to really understand Amazon, right? And so a key point of my research and my own work as an Amazonian was that I thought the conditions were actually going to be quite similar to that of other warehouses, right? So in terms of high quotas, temp work, sort of low end, low road, warehousing kind of work that many people are accustomed to in this sector, was actually quite significantly different. So I went back a lot to Ford, right? Not so much Fordism, you know, as people understand in political economy and the post-war period, but how Ford reconciled his application of Taylorism, right, or scientific management, right? And so because a lot of the discussion about Amazon is the grueling work conditions, is workers having to urinate in bottles, is kind of what we know of Amazon. But when I actually walked into an Amazon, I was actually shocked at something else, right? And I was shocked at something different. And please don't take this as, I'm not trying to sell Amazon here at all, but I think it's part of their labor strategy. And it's a key part of their labor fix, right? So for Ford, the question was, how do you stop turnover, right? And how can they stop turnover at the assembly line, right? And it was the introduction of the $5 wage. It was other incentives and benefits. But with that, there was this insidious sort of the creation of the new type of Ford worker, right? So the intrusive surveillance, going to workers' homes to make sure that they were, you know, abstinent and that they weren't drinking and that they were good Christians. And so what Amazon and what I argue is that Amazon takes elements of this part of Ford and it utilizes it not because it's pro-worker, but it's a key part of its labor fix. And so, I mean, for Amazon, what's fundamental is its quotas, right? What's fundamental is its ability to access a constant pool of labor, right? And a constant, not just, but a disposable pool of labor, right? And so one of the key things that Amazon has done, in a way, and when you see this when you're an Amazon worker, when you talk with Amazon workers, is that there's 2 sides to Amazon, right? So there's Amazon, we are the family, we work hard, we make fun, we work hard, we have fun, we make history, right? And so there's sort of the cult of Amazon, and Amazon utilizes this strategy through stand-up meetings, through My Voice, through other techniques, but also a lot of workers are drawn into Amazon, and Amazon utilizes this quite consciously, is through this idea that it represents something quite different than other low-wage jobs, right? The promise of promotions, benefits, very basic things. So in Quebec, a lot of warehouses don't offer you basic health and safety equipment. Amazon will offer that, right? Amazon will give you $100 voucher to buy your safety boots. It's kind of unheard of in other warehouses. Amazon provides, their education fund for workers, right? Even if they quit and never come back to Amazon. And so a lot of workers are wooed by this, right? The possibility of stability, the promise of job promotions. Even if they won't make it from level 1 to level 3, there's the possibility that, that they will become an ambassador, right? And a lot of that sort of mythology of Amazon begins to dissipate pretty quickly, right? And this is where there's this contradiction, right? Of why is Amazon doing this, right? And it's a key part because, and I think a lot of it is, it's to create a loyal, flexible workforce. So what Amazon is fundamentally trying to do is weed out the weak from the strong, right? And we see this, that Amazon is constantly trying to do this with its workforce. So if you look at the divisions when workers begin, maybe in the US, in Canada, there's no more use of temp agencies, right? So simply its temp workforce is the white badges, right? So there's this, for many people who might know or might not know, Amazon utilizes its 2-badge system, right? So there are white badges who are seasonal workers, and then blue badges who are permanent, right? And for a lot of white badges, they're hired during the peak season, from October to January, from 3 to 6 months, but there's a constant promise that your contract could be renewed or eventually you'll become a blue badge. And in one interview, a worker described it, Amazon becomes like a state. If you have a blue badge, you have all the privileges and benefits of an Amazonian. When you're a white badge, you have nothing. So your whole goal is to become a citizen of the Amazon state. And so, and that's really the mentality that sort of drags people, and Amazon sort of compels them to actually to meet those quotas, right? To continually to try to meet those quotas in order to attain a blue badge, right? And so, I mean, the whole point about creating a loyal, flexible workforce is knowing that that again, that there's the sort of digital taylorism aspect of it, and the sort of the surveillance capitalism on the shop floor is really about pushing workers in a way that and you don't see in other warehouses, right? And that Amazon utilizes a tactic of sort of retraining and recoaching, right? So if you look at other warehouses where temp work is used, if workers don't meet quotas, they're simply fired, right? They're just simply out the door. But in Amazon, that's not the case, right? So there's this constant, workers are invited for retraining, recoaching, and so there's a constant pressure on workers. And there's also pressure on ambassadors and pressure on PAs, right? And so that pressure, in my own experience, but also from other workers, is sort of opaque, right? It's not because any manager sort of hates you, but it's that there's sort of this digital aspect. There's this neutral sort of control, right? Where everyone is subservient to the algorithm, to their TCI device, right? And managers are simply following the rules of the TCI device as well, or their platform. And so they're constantly trying to draw people into that quota, knowing that people, if they won't make it, they'll just leave on their own, right? And the kind of pressure. This is some quotes from workers that I talked with, and this is from one picker: controlling people and manipulating through permanent coaching. It is a new way of doing things. If workers don't get those rates, they're pressured. I was crying in the ship dock. I'm 50. They tell us to use our A to Z app to seek help. And he goes on, for us, we don't have time to seek help. We're just getting our rates, but they want us to smile. They're making me cry. So there's this constant pressure on workers to meet quotas. And one thing maybe I'll just add quickly where the institutional aspect comes into play is that it's really important that you see when Amazon tries to circumvent the law, and especially here in Quebec. And so, and as someone who fights a lot of cases with Amazon workers, they've created their own internal system. So workers are expected to use things like My Voice. Workers are expected to use Amcare. Workers are expected to use their internal arbitration system, right? Which is a third-party company somewhere in San Diego. So a lot of times, Amazon tells workers that we're pro-worker, right? Use these tools. But then what happens is when workers feel that their rights have been violated, and they have been, Amazon's resolution mechanisms even further drags them away from having their rights enforced, right? So workers can't get occupational health and safety insurance anymore because it's too late. They can't meet the timelines to file complaints. And then workers express themselves, and then workers then are penalized even further, right? So all of this is to really to sort of to weed out the weak from the strong. And so I think this Amazon's model presents a number of challenges for labor organizing that I thought were going to be similar, the challenges to that of other warehouses. And I mean, one of the things under Fordism was that, you know, the high turnover was considered a problem, right? But for Amazon, the high turnover is wanted, it's desired, and it's managed through its, you know, its form of digital taylorism, right? Or what Ellen Reese calls, you know, algocratic rule, right? And so it's managed. So the high turnover doesn't actually cause a problem for Amazon, but it's actually wanted because it keeps workers there, one, who are loyal, who might make it to a level 3, and those who don't, they meet those rates for as long as they can until they're too tired and then they quit, right? And so even though in the US there's the 150% turnover and we have a similar rate in Canada, it's not an issue. But that turnover creates a challenge for labor. How do you organize in a workplace that has a turnover rate of 150%? By the time you actually meet workers, they're gone a month later, right? And I think a key issue, I think for us, for labor organizers, we always think of the bread and butter issues, right? It's about wages, it's about benefits, it's about pensions. But at Amazon, they'll throw those things at workers. Those carrots are not the issue for Amazon, right? It's control over the labor process, which is key, right? And Jeff Bezos has been, you know, very blunt about it, right? So then how do we fight when the key question is over quotas, it's over digital surveillance, which are also at the heart at Amazon's model, right? And I think another challenge that we're confronted with is inter-union competition, right? Amazon is too big for any one union to take on, and we're beginning to see that competition play out here between MAU, the Montreal Amazon Workers Union, Teamsters, Unifor, which used to be the Canadian Auto Workers. And so we're beginning to have that competition when we should be thinking about bigger, right? That would give Amazon workers the space to actually to organize. But I think there's also significant opportunity, right? Amazon can't pick up and leave like a Walmart can, right? Amazon is fixed. So when you work at Amazon, you realize all of these institutions are wrapped in together, right? And so no fulfillment center is simply a fulfillment center with all of those items, right? They're regionally networked, right? So when someone makes an order, that fulfillment can happen in YUL2 or YUL1. So they're regionally networked. So, and the more Amazon is trying to compete with others now, the closer and closer it needs to be to urban centers, right? It just can't pick up and leave, right? I mean, there's a joke. I mean, maybe the one thing they can do with Staten Island is put JFK 8 on a giant ship outside of, on the ocean. But other than that, they're harder to actually to move, to close, and that's something we've seen in the labor movement here in Quebec, right? Walmart was successfully organized in Quebec. Walmart's response shut the Walmart down, right? I mean, the other thing that's, structural to, I think, to warehouse workers is that Amazon can't be automated fully, right? And that the best that it can do is mesh us with, with human technology. And I think so. So the fear of the robot, while it might be coming at some time down the road, for now, there's sort of that strength, and also with with the current labor shortage, right? And I think another thing that workers have been using in Montreal and other places, and I'll end on this, is that Amazon's idea of workers' inclusion into the labor process is something that is a tool that could be used against them, right? And that a lot of the key leaders in MAWU, the Montreal Amazon Workers Union, haven't been fired, right? It's actually quite incredible. They've been vocal. They've been using my voice. The first worker, the leader, got up at the lunchroom during break and said, "I'm forming a union." Was not fired. It's actually mind blowing. And so these, the fact that Amazon doesn't actually fire people but wants people to quit on their own, accord, is a weapon for us. And then I think things like my voice, Amazon operates a health and safety committee that workers are going to take over here. These are all tools for us to organize. Also, there's a lot of disillusionment that you begin to see with Amazon's process to include workers, right? And that it's a tool against them. And that's been something that's been drawing workers actually to wanting to organize. So I think while there's significant challenges and pressures in terms of the actual organizing, there are things that can be used in our favor. And there are certain institutional arrangements here that very quickly is that we have some of the strongest laws in terms of labor, right, in North America, right, in terms of the right to organize, card check. There's even the idea of making a complaint around Amazon's use of artificial intelligence, because there's already in Quebec labor law that it's deemed as workplace psychological harassment, right, in another case, but no Amazon worker has brought it forward. So I think I believe that there's the ability, and I think we're going to be successful in actually forming the first union in Quebec. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Now we have our discussant, Sheheryar, Executive Director of the Warehouse Worker Resource Center in Southern California. Sheheryar.
Great. So thank you to all the presenters. What I wanted to do to try to tie this all together is to think about the question of what happens when a company faces resistance in a different geographies and different communities in different parts of the world. I think that's really kind of the story of what we've heard today, right? Is different forms of resistance, different structures. And I think the Walmart versus Amazon example is really exemplary and useful for us. So in our organizing in Southern California, a lot of the stuff that we did early in 2011, 2012, 2013 was focused on the Walmart supply chain and really building power among subcontracted warehouse workers in Southern California. And I think that example, comparing with the way that Amazon is playing out in our region, as well as what Scott mentioned in terms of the way that Walmart versus Amazon is playing out in other parts of the world, says a lot about the way that Amazon has learned a lot and is really kind of the next level beyond Walmart. What we saw was Walmart, instead of bending, does break a lot of the time, right? They go into a market, it doesn't work for them culturally, it doesn't work for them in terms of their ability to be the number one or number two operator, and they pull out. They come into a region and they they don't necessarily want to change their operations and their practices, especially like a lot of the cultural stuff that they do. And they decide, okay, this isn't for us. We're going to focus back in, especially the United States market. What we saw in the warehousing sector was they were using a lot of third-party operations and use of staffing agencies to move their goods through our region. Similarly, that was happening in Chicago and New Jersey. And when we were organizing workers, mostly for kind of militant minority action, strikes, that sort of thing, the company generally did prefer to fight as hard as they could rather than to change their practices. A few years later, what we saw was that they actually started taking those workers in-house. Those workers went from staffing agencies to direct employment. By 2018, Walmart had actually brought on some of those workers directly and brought those warehouses in-house. And what I heard later was that was actually because former Amazon managers had been hired into Walmart, and Walmart had kind of integrated some of the practices of Amazon, say, okay, maybe we should absorb some of these tactics. Maybe we should make a little bit of a tactical move back, right? They raised wages, they changed their conditions inside of a lot of the warehouses in the Inland Empire. I think in some ways in response to our organizing, and also in some ways in response to the larger question about turnover that was mentioned. So again, my point is that what we're seeing is Amazon is a lot smarter, a lot faster, a lot quicker than Walmart was. And in a lot of these markets, instead of breaking, they're bending, right? They're changing their models. They're doing what they have to do. So looking at what happened in Mexico, right, with the changes in labor market reforms, Amazon is trying to hang on and roll with that, right? In Canada, as was mentioned, when Walmart organized stores, when the UFCW organized stores in Walmart in Quebec in the early 2000s, what happened? They shut those stores down, right? And what Mustafa is describing is something very different in terms of the way that Amazon is responding in a very savvy way to organizing in those shops. And I know they fired people in other places, and it's probably inevitable that there will be firings, but they're not being as ham-handed as Walmart was in terms of just, okay, we'll just shut down the whole system. We'll, in Texas, when meat cutters organized in 1990s, they just shut down every meat cutting operation in Walmart in the whole country just to be able to make it so they can't unionize, right? So again, like what we see is a smarter, more savvy approach from Amazon, but to the same goals, right? To the same goal of production, right? As Mustafa said, of keeping the production going. So when Amazon opened their first warehouse in California in 2011, we had a friend at UCR who was a grad student actually who got a job at one of the Amazon facilities, and he was doing a lot of analysis then, those first couple of years, and a lot of the cultural Kaizen stuff that Amazon was really pushing with the workers was really indicative of they wanted to have a culture that was very, Mustafa was saying, very focused on not just pushing workers, but integrating them into a culture of production, of really believing in the company. What we saw soon after, by 2013, 2014, was that kind of went out the window, at least in Southern California. They were just all about moving product. They still have this stuff written on the walls, move fast, make history, all that stuff, but they didn't really act like it. The turnover was all about the turnover. And, we saw that the reputation of Amazon in our community went down very quickly as they became more and more prominent. Basically, every working person in Southern California, especially in the Inland Empire, either has worked or knows somebody who's worked in an Amazon facility. And they know that they do work people very fast, that people burn out very quickly. So I think what Mustafa is describing is actually a cultural turn that Amazon is making very recently. I'm seeing it too. Now that we've gone through COVID, now that Amazon has doubled in size in the last couple of years, they've run out of people to burn through. They are no longer able to just kind of keep flowing and bring people in. There's nobody who wants to work there anymore. The market tensions and the hot labor market is part of that too. They can't hang on to people. So they're going back to some of those practices that Mustafa described. I think that's absolutely what we're seeing here too, in order to try to hang on to folks, because they're not competing on wages the way they used to in California, at least. They're not competing the same way that they used to by just being the kind of employer of last resort. So I think with the new CEO, Andy Jassy, the company is at a crossroads where they have to decide how they respond to these labor market changes, how they respond to the rapid growth, but also just do they want to hang on to that high turnover model that got them to this point, but might not work any further. And I think the last thing I would add is that question about productivity, right? That again, Mustafa mentioned, that's what they know they have to hang on to. They want to keep that productivity, and that's why we in California focused on pace of work and rate by passing AB 701 and really focusing on how do we make sure that workers who are being pushed to move as quickly as possible do have some rights. But I think that's what they really do know they have to hang on to. All the other stuff is negotiable. And the last thing I would say is there is a question in the air that I think we all should be considering is, how does Amazon react to the biggest punch they've got, which is ALU in New York? Are they going to negotiate a contract? Are they going to, and that's, I think, a test for all of us to watch. How does Amazon respond, but also how does the American labor movement respond to probably the biggest contract fight in decades that really will determine how organizing in Amazon and a lot of companies plays out. How will the NLRB respond? Amazon is really focused on the NLRB as being a biased player in the process, and the NLRB has been great the last year or so. How will that change when the Republicans take over next year? So I think there's some really big contested questions around the ALU site and whether that is indicative of a real change in the way that labor in the United States operates, but also in the way that Amazon responds to us. And so I think that's really a question for all of us to be watching and considering, but also weighing in and trying to show how best we can do. So I'll stop there. I think we're at time.
Thank you, Sheheryar. We come to the end of our time with the indulgence of Lyra. If we can take 5 minutes, perhaps, since we have a linked panel coming next. There are really 3 questions. Sally posed questions about intersectionality and Kata specifically about immigrant labor in Quebec. I was wondering whether there's an age and or gender element to the blue versus white badges. For Mustafa, Sarah asked about lessons for India and Middle East, North Africa, even worse informality than Latin America. I'm not sure if we have a good response to that. Kat and I were conferring, but at least there is historically labor institutions in Mexico and in Brazil, and perhaps within a change in government. And Brazil will have some more attention to enforcement, which has been seriously eroded. And Lilak asked about Amazon in Israel using the post office for delivery or other services, so commercial services. So in Latin America, we've seen to them moving to their own network and then their own delivery service partners or subcontracted firms with exclusivity for Amazon, which is kind of trajectory we've seen in other markets where they've been longer. They've done that in a short period of time. But anyway, those questions about intersectionality and the nature of the workforce and how that intersects with Amazon's labor control strategy, perhaps if Mustafa or any other panelists would like to respond.
If I could just, I have to get to a final, so if I could just respond super quickly.
Sure.
Yeah, so we did find, our region is predominantly Hispanic, so it's not at all odd that we would find a very high percentage of Latinos in our warehouses. And we've done a number of surveys, and then our most recent set of surveys also confirmed that. We also have found an increasing number of women being hired. And then once you look within the warehouses and see the job categories that you find that a lot of the men have, higher paying jobs to the extent that that is possible. There's kind of a flattening within Amazon, but if you look more broadly within warehouses, some of our earlier surveys demonstrated that men tended to have the higher paid sort of forklift jobs. So Latino men kind of had captured that category of jobs, where women tended to have the lower paid jobs. Now, again, within Amazon, there's kind of a flattening, but our Amazon, this last round of surveys did show an awful lot of women. Now, part of that was because we had an awful lot of women doing the surveys. So, because we had kind of a snowballing kind of strategy, that could have been part of why we saw that. But the population here is Latino and about half and half women. So it does kind of reflect the population. But this was a wonderful panel. I do need to get to a final. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. It was great sharing our research and getting to learn about what everyone else is doing. And I'm really impressed by the number of people that are working on this important issue. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Juliann. We have people coming in for the next panel, or perhaps leaving. We have the panelists for our next session. Nick has already said in the chat that he could talk to India, which hopefully speak to the question that Sarah had raised, who's one of our panelists for the next session. But is there anything that you would like to respond to, Mustafa?
Yeah, quickly. I mean, I'll just respond to Sarah's question. So, I mean, it's actually different. So, I mean, the people that I met, Amazon was not the employer of last resort. It was a language question, actually. There's a lot of young, educated people who couldn't get jobs in the service sector, right? But where you see that kind of really racialized new immigrant labor in other warehouses is because, quote unquote, the lack of Canadian experience, right? All the things that, that temp agencies use or employers use. So Amazon was actually quite different in terms of the wages between the white badges and blue badge. They're the same. The key element is the benefits and getting out of being a picker or packer or storer, right? Eventually you'll get out of the worst of Amazon as quickly as possible, right? So, but the wages are actually the same. You don't have any of the benefits, right? And you can be hired and fired at any point. They write that in the contract, which is also illegal under Quebec law.
Anything that you would like to add to your comments or react to, Sheheryar?
No, that's good.
Okay. All right, well, we have about 8 minutes until the second panel begins. So if anyone wants to take a brief break, but I